Greetings and welcome back to what I believe is going to be the most interesting episode of this new series, Perspectives to date. I'm here with someone that most of you know by now. He's one of the best content producers in the MGTOW community, CS MGTOW. But more uniquely, I think he's someone who knows sort of two worlds. It's sort of not a tale of two cities, but a tale of two worlds in his case, because he's both Nigerian and English. And we're going to be talking about Nigeria today, and by extension, I think the third world. And I guess part of the intention behind that is to offer some insight into what that world looks like, what kind of things that go on there. And I think ultimately we're going to leave more informed. It's going to be, we're definitely going to gain new knowledge and information, but we're going to get a really good idea of what we don't want, frankly speaking, the West to turn into. Thank you for being there. I'm really excited to talk to you about this subject.
Oh, same here, Stardust. It's a real pleasure again to be with you here.
Yeah, so, I mean, for those of you who don't know, I have to assume some ignorance. I mean, Nigeria, I'll start with the things I know. Nigeria is a relatively large country on the west coast of Africa. I can't go too much further back, but I know from 1800 to, I believe, 1960,
yes.
It was a British colony.
Yes.
1960, there was independence was gained, and then from 1960 to about 2000 or 1999, there were many military coups and juntas and just a lot of chaos, as I understand it.
Yes, absolutely. I lived through one of the military coups over there, and it was definitely the most dangerous time I've ever experienced in my lifetime. It was.
And in between that, I believe, was it in the 70s that Nigeria discovered its vast oil wealth?
Absolutely. And what followed then was a pretty brutal civil war that raged for about 3 years, where the oil-producing part of the country, attempted to essentially create a secessionist state.
Yeah, and then OPEC was involved, and I think there was a big play. I'm butchering his name. Olusegun Obasanjo.
Yes, Olusegun Obasanjo.
Right. Yeah. He was a prominent, I guess, was he democratically elected? Or
he became a military ruler during the Biafran War. So he was the commander who actually called the ceasefire to the war. And then later on, he then became a democratically elected president of Nigeria, and was one of the presidents who left power voluntarily, which up to then was very, very rare in our country.
And I mean, as far as I think Nigeria is relatively diverse in terms of ethnicity. As far as I understand, there are three major populations. There's the Hausa population, the Igbo, and the Yoruba. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. However, they're not uniform groups. So we have 247 distinct languages, many thousands of dialects. And even, for example, groups that you would consider Yoruba, they will say, look, I'm not Yoruba, I'm Ekiti, or, I'm, or they'll say, look, I'm not Igbo, I'm Igbo,
But the official language is, in fact, English for all practical purposes.
Yes, English is our lingua franca.
Right, and I mean, this is obviously due to the legacy of the British Empire. And I imagine you would not only not take offense at the claim, and maybe even agree with that. I mean, Nigeria is effectively a third world country.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Okay. Without a shadow of a doubt.
So, I mean, maybe you can tell us some stories, to begin with, but most of us grew up in the West. My neighborhood wasn't fantastic, but it was hardly the third world. By way of contrast, what was growing up in Nigeria like, say, contrasted with the UK or any other Western country?
For sure. I guess what I would say immediately is that within the West, and I've been very, very fortunate to move to this part of the world, the feeling of safety, the ever-present feeling that you're going to be okay, that, there is the off chance that you'll be a victim, of some kind of crime or violent act. This is for sure. It's in Nigeria. This is an ever-present issue. So the murder rate is sky high. The rates of violent crimes are incredibly high, far more so than you would have in a traditional Western, kind of society. So I guess the big thing that one notices over there, and you notice in the way people live and the way they carry themselves and the way they move about, is the ever-present fear of violence, not only from other citizens, but also from your government. So in the West, at least in the parts of the West that I've lived in, you have a trust in your local police that they will apply justice with some degree of uniformity, that they won't arbitrarily simply, summarily execute you. This is something you cannot count on in my country.
So let's touch on the police. I mean, I want to be fluid here. I've observed, just through researching history, that, I mean, obviously in certain countries, the police, outside of the West generally, and even in the West, but generally outside the West, tend to be pretty corrupt and venal, meaning it's really easy to bribe them. If there's an issue, if you flash enough money, you can oftentimes get off. Would you say that's applicable to Nigeria?
Absolutely. If you have money, you can get away with absolutely anything. If you happen to kill
anything,
yes, absolutely.
So let's just hypothetical scenario. Let's say you're very wealthy, and the police find out that you killed somebody and you dumped him in a river. You can just bribe the police, and that's fine?
Yes, absolutely. Maybe you won't even need to bribe the police. Sometimes your reputation is just enough.
Right.
And if people find out, the other people, if you're wealthy enough, they'll say the person stole something. And
right.
Of course, that would then justify the death of the person.
But I mean, and through conversations we've had previously, mentioned that, so the notion of burglary, which is relatively rare in the West, if you're living in a home in Nigeria, I mean, talk about ready. I mean, you have a shotgun ready. You have to assume someone's going to break in.
Yeah.
And if he does, there's no negotiation. You just shoot him dead, and then you essentially dump his body on the road. Is that accurate?
Yes, absolutely. One of I guess, the big differences between crime in the West and, let's say, a third world country, and I can speak of the experience that I've had in Nigeria, is that the expectation that the criminal is only there to take your property is, it's an expectation you can rely upon in the West. In the third world, or in particular in Nigeria, there is the expectation that the criminal will not only take your property, but will very, very much take, they're keen to take your life as well. And there are lots and lots of reasons for that. There's a huge disparity between rich and poor. So there is a real hatred, and I'm not suggesting this is unearned, of people who have a lot of money, because, a significant amount of them made it just through corruption or murder or theft, so when a burglar comes to your home, they will come armed and they will absolutely kill. And this is a very, very common occurrence. So what then happens, of course, is that homeowners, for all intents and purposes, create an armed fort in their home. So you would have multiple guard dogs if you're in the, let's say, middle or upper class. And there's a high likelihood, of course, then that you're a potential target for such acts. You would have multiple guard dogs, you would have multiple firearms, and they would be loaded. And your goal is not to deter. Your goal is to make sure the person doesn't leave alive. It's a very, very simple goal. You aim for critical mass and you shoot.
And let's say, I mean, it's not just imagery. Obviously, this must happen. If a homeowner shoots to kill, and I mean, I imagine there's no due process. There's no real investigation. He need only say,
yes, he need only prove. I should say, proof suggests there's some trial. Your body need only be there. The fact you were there at night is enough of a justification socially for your death. Right.
So, I mean, having any amount of money, being middle class or upper middle class in Nigeria, means that you are on constant guard, essentially for your life and certainly for your belongings and your wealth.
Yes, absolutely. And again, I think this is something pretty consistent across the third world, because I've lived in another third world country in Southeast Asia, and while it certainly wasn't as, it's a developing country versus just a pure third world country, But for sure, absolutely, it's a very, very dangerous part of the world, and as a result, it drives, certainly in me, a desire to not see Europe become that, just that kind of a third world, very, very dangerous place.
Yeah, and for those who haven't watched it, CS put out a video about a month ago, and I personally think it's his best to date of gender and post-government societies, where he talked about what happened in the Balkan Peninsula during the 90s, specifically with reference to men, but more generally, I guess, the level of chaos there. I mean, perhaps it's not quite as bad, but, I mean, there seems to be in Nigeria always something going on. Now, you seem to also have a very fractured Christian versus Muslim population that generally, I would say, doesn't get along too well. Is that accurate to say?
Yes, I think that's very, very accurate. The violence is particularly pronounced along the parts of the country where you have both a Muslim and a Christian population, often either in towns side by side or in cities where it's like a 50-50 split. So the kind of confluence areas, places like Kano, these are incredibly violent places. There's, it's a huge kind of religious, cauldron, as it were, and violence just comes out of the blue, and you will have violence from both sides. So Christians will indiscriminately murder Muslims, and Muslims will indiscriminately murder Christians, burning mosques, burning churches.
And this is specifically sectarian violence based on religion.
Absolutely, absolutely.
My feeling is in a place like Lagos, for those of you who don't know, I believe, it's not the capital, but it's the biggest city in Nigeria.
It's the former capital.
Former capital. Yeah. Is Abuja, is that the capital?
Yes, Abuja.
Abuja, okay, Abuja. That Lagos has less sectarian violence, but it's much more sort of this guy looks like he has money, let's stab him and take his money kind of violence.
Absolutely. So Lagos is where you're, statistically, at least in the south of our country, more likely to be a victim of murder or, just basically just have somebody spray bullets at your car at night, if you're stupid enough to be driving at night, that is. So Lagos, yes, absolutely. You don't tend to see a lot of the religious killings in Lagos. You just tend to have people essentially wanting to have what you have, and you then working hard to protect it behind huge gated communities where you just have essentially just armed guards day and night.
So it's safe to say that wandering through the market, even during the daytime, is not entirely safe.
It depends. It really, really depends. There's always the chance in Nigeria. I mean, for example, I've seen on numerous occasions where an individual will be accused of theft, and the punishment for theft is execution at the hands of the mob. So if an individual is accused of theft, people will simply beat you up, and they will throw a tire around your neck, pour kerosene on you, and set you alight and watch you burn in front of them.
This has been documented.
Oh yes, absolutely. I've witnessed this dozens of times. It's a very, very routine occurrence. So if an individual is accused of theft, you're very fortunate if the police get there. If the police bother to come out of their police stations and they actually happen to get there, they may be able to save you from the mob. That is really your only salvation at that point.
And I imagine when the police get there eventually, after the person is burnt alive, they just, they don't really do much.
No, that's the thing, I guess, that there's a huge difference in the culture. So, and again, I think it may be something unique to Nigeria, but it also may be something unique to the third world. That in the West, the consequences of theft are far, they're not as great. So, for example, if somebody comes to your home and they steal, let's say, a television set, your insurance will cover it, or maybe you can buy another one if you're wealthy enough, or actually, that television set, your survival doesn't rest upon it. It's an entertainment device. In a third world country, when somebody comes to burgle you, and you are always maybe 3 or 4 days away from starvation anyway, there's a very, very different level of aggression that people will comfortably mete out to the perpetrator, of such a theft. So in the West, you call the police and the police carry out an investigation. In the third world country, particularly, I can speak from from the case of my country, Nigeria, they will kill you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's funny. I've not spent any time in Western Africa, full disclosure, but I have spent a decent amount of time, on holidays and traveling in Eastern Africa, particularly Kenya. And this was before the political unrest occurred a little while back, and Kenya was considered sort of a model of African civility and everything. But even then, it was dangerous theft. There, of course, tons of disease. I saw lots of people with elephantitis of various limbs. People with malaria, homeless everywhere, but I mean, not homeless like in the West, as in, they were pushing their wagon and they were munching on a piece of bread. I mean, these guys looked like they were a couple hours away from death sometimes, depending on the area. And this was one of the model African countries at the time.
Sure.
I can only imagine in a country that's not considered model or perfect or whatever that means, how bad it could be. So there's a huge wealth disparity, obviously, and really would it be safe to distill Nigerian society into the haves and the have-nots, and that's it?
It depends. It depends, and I think that's an excellent question. But what you tend to have are individuals who have, and okay, so you have the ultra wealthy who will drive around in Lagos and Bentleys and Ferraris and that there's that kind of certain group, and there are and these individuals, of course, tend to be the kind of most well guarded. That they'll live in huge developments, which, for all intents and purposes, are protected by the government. They're known as GRAs, so government reservation areas. And it would be foolhardy for a criminal or a thief to go into these areas. It's very, very unlikely they would come out alive, just because the level of ammunition that they would face. It's simply foolhardy. So on some level, that level of wealth, you're slightly less likely to be, let's say, a victim of theft or murder or something.
Probably because you have like 20 Rottweilers, armed guards with AK-47s. You have your own weapons. You have basically the works.
Absolutely. But again, these kind of individuals, they tend to be victims of crime if let's say they're driving from one part of the country to another, and then there are lots of highway robbers. And then they'll push barrels onto the road and they'll just rob everybody and just shoot everybody up. But the real victims of crime are usually the individuals who tend to have money but don't have quite enough to live in, let's say, a government reservation area or to be able to hire off-duty.
Like upper middle class, I guess.
Absolutely. So even within the wealthy, there are various strata. So I guess the goal of most people over there is to get into that, either stay poor or get into the ultra wealthy category, just because it's very unsafe to be just somewhat rich. You have to be wealthy enough that you either live in, for all intents and purposes, an armed area, or you have off-duty police officers protecting you, or off-duty soldiers. So it's a bit of a weird one. And again, I'm not suggesting that the poor people in the country are uniformly just out to steal. You have criminals in every single society, and I guess the difference between the first world and the third world is the extent to which the criminals will resort to lethal violence, and the extent to which you're permitted socially to resort to lethal violence in return. So let's say, for example, in the UK, I certainly would have no legal justification to murder a man if he broke into my home or broke into my place of business. And that isn't the case in Nigeria. I would absolutely be on very, very firm legal ground, and I wouldn't even be obligated to report it to the police. Also,
so he enters your shop, he tries to stab you and steal your stuff. You pull out a shotgun, you buckshot him in the chest, he's dead, and you just dump the body in the street or whatever.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, for example, I can maybe give you when I first went back to to Nigeria to go and start, my boarding house over there. I remember my drivers, shouting to me, look, wind up your window. I said, what's this man talking about? There's a dead body by the side of the road, and just coming, having then spent some of my childhood in Europe, I just found this a shocking thing. How can somebody just leave a dead body by the side of the road? But then you see that more regularly. You realize, hey, it's unfortunately part of the experience of a third world country.
Yeah. And the police themselves, I guess they act with impunity. So if they see someone running away with a bunch of merchandise, they can just shoot them in the back, I guess.
Yes, they can, but they don't need such a justification. Simply being a load of guys hanging around in a place in Lagos can get you murdered by the police on the wrong day. So for example, there have been so many cases, and this is just common knowledge over there. Let's say, for example, you have 20 or 30 guys, as guys tend to do, hanging around, let's say, a snooker, there'll be places for entertainment. So maybe there's like a snooker table somewhere, and you pay to rent the table. Let's say there are 30 guys. Police may just roll up in these huge wagons, and they will tell the boys, and they're usually always men. They will tell them to, so that they're wearing, shirts or t-shirts. So one has to tie the t-shirt to the other for the other t-shirt. So I don't know if that makes sense. So you tie your t-shirt, or shirt to this person's shirt. So then they can't run away. They will load them up into the van, and they were just going to shoot them.
Sounds efficient, I guess.
Yeah, the police are incredibly corrupt, incredibly violent. And again, these are the main differences in the third world. In the third world, or maybe again, I shouldn't uniformly describe the third world. In Nigeria, you cannot rely on the police to enforce justice. That is one aspect. But also, as a poor individual, the police are not there for you. They are there to quite literally protect everybody else from you. And you are seen as nothing. Literally nothing. You can be murdered at will. The police will face no consequence. They will simply murder you, and they will just kill you where you stand. You disobey an order, they will shoot you. They tell you to move your car out of the way. You don't do it in time, they will shoot you.
And you've seen this.
Yes, absolutely. I've seen, but you tend to get a lot of this. So for example, when I was there and we had a military coup, the soldiers ran everything. And soldiers, the soldiers want to have priority for everything. So, there's a queue for a petrol station, and of course they started rationing. It just fell to pieces. There's a queue at a petrol station. The soldiers will simply get there and say, we want petrol first. And that may be fair, hey, well, whatever, that is fair enough. But what then isn't fair enough is that the soldiers simply start shooting. Not only because, of course, that they're shooting at people, but for the love of God, you're in a petrol station. So, of course, the place fucking explodes. The person isn't sharp enough to realize you don't shoot live ammunition in a petrol station. Then everybody dies. Including the guy doing the shooting.
So I imagine because of this environment, you were well trained in firearms.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Firearms.
I know my way around guns.
So you're not just, you can fire a pistol, automatic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because in the UK, you don't really find that very often.
No. In fact, when I've had friends in the UK and they know my, let's say, my enthusiasm for guns, they tend to find it quite odd. Because and again, I don't think it's good or bad. It just isn't part of the culture over here. Over here, you can rely on the fact that if somebody burgles your home, if they see you, they're far more likely to simply run away. They genuinely aren't there to harm you. They're there to take your
stuff. But that said, in the UK, and I've heard stories, if you were burgled in the UK, and let's say you have a baseball bat or a cricket, and you bash the crap out of the guy, you could actually go to jail for that.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I know a guy. So there was a guy I used to go to college with over here, and somebody broke into his home. And he pretty much did that. He got a baseball bat. He was scared, and he just went at the guy. But I think he went too far, and they tried to put him in jail. Finally, the guy woke up. He was in like a coma or something for a while. he woke up, and then the family, then they realized he was okay, that, he was going to live through it. They decided not to, they persuaded him not to press the charges or whatever, and then the police for some reason dropped it as well.
Yeah, there was a story, I think it was in the States from years ago, and I don't know if it's fictitious or not. Supposedly it's not, of a burglar who had apparently in his attempt to rob the place. He didn't actually get to it, but he had fallen through the roof of the place he was supposed to rob. And supposedly, if the tale be true, he sued the person who maintained the building or the owner because of structural weakness, because he hadn't actually robbed. I mean, it's not technically illegal to prance on the roof,
For sure.
even though his intentions were clear. And I think he apparently won the case. I don't know if that's true. I heard that story.
I've heard of one. I've heard of actually a couple like that, and I find it incredible. And maybe it's because I come from a third world country where he wouldn't have left alive. To talk less of suing, that's incredible. To admit he went there to steal.
Yeah. Well, but his get out clause was that it's not illegal to walk around the roof, but you can't. It was obvious what his intention was.
Sure.
And, he got some non-insignificant amount of money. I mean, tens of thousands of dollars. I don't really know, but
Sure.
I don't remember. It was a while ago, but it just goes to show just how vastly different. Now, you also told me a story, if you don't mind retelling, about a situation with a guy that you were trying to help out,
Sure.
and he tried to rip you off anyway.
For sure. It was the guy at the airport.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
I still to this day cannot believe that mentality. So I arrive at the airport, and I did what I typically do, and I'm not proud of this, but I didn't bother to get a visa because I travel on my British passport, and for me, it's just always a case of, look, it's cheaper to pay the bribe at the airport than go through the hassle of.
Is it really that way? They give you hassle and you just you hand them the fat stacks and they leave you alone?
Yes, for sure. I mean, you have to know how to do it. You don't want to bribe a person in front of like a
Right.
queue, so it has to. So again, it's the usual procedure. Where's your visa? Oh yeah, god damn, I forgot. Yeah, hey, okay, so you have to follow our colleague into this room somewhere. Okay. And you just work it out, it's, but for me, it's too much of an inconvenience to go to the High Commission, to get a visa, to fill in the forms. So yeah, I just pay a bribe when I get to the airport. And there was a guy who had just been deported, he was a Nigerian guy as well. He'd just been deported. It was either the Netherlands or somewhere in Europe, maybe it was from the UK, whatever. He'd just been deported. And it was very, very clear. So it became very, very clear he didn't have the money to pay them a bribe to let him go, and that's what the immigration staff were looking. You have to pay us something. You kind of see what's going on. And he kept on saying, well, can you at least look? I don't want to come to Nigeria, of course. Can you just get me on a plane back to where I've just come from? They said, look, we can't do that. They just deported you. We're not going to let you leave the airport until you put something our way. And he said, look, I don't even have enough money to get a taxi here or to get a bus to my hometown. So, I felt sorry for the guy. So when they were no longer speaking with him, I called him to the side. I said, look, where are you going and how much do you need? He said, I'm going here. I knew that part of the country. He gave me a figure. I said, okay, don't worry. I said, look, my stepdad's coming to pick me up soon. So I'll make sure you get the cash you need to get to where you're going to. So then when my stepfather got there, I said, look, I need this amount of money because I haven't been to the office to change money, so I don't actually have any naira on there. I only have sterling. So, but do you have some naira? And I'll make sure I just get back to you later. But I can use to just give this guy. He literally he's just been deported and he's stranded. So let me just put some cash his way. And he said, yeah, how much do you need? And I gave him the figure. He said, what the fuck? He said, that's ludicrous. So he said, that could take you around the country 4 or 5 times. And I just thought, this is insane. Look at this guy. I just tried, I don't know you. I'm just going out of my way to help you. And even in your state, all you can think of is basically just trying to pick my pocket for far more. It's not that. I mean, the amount that he asked versus what he needed was astronomical. It's like asking for £1,000 when you need only 10. It was just, he just saw this guy coming. He just thought I was a bit of an idiot. And I probably was, but yeah, so that taught me that, no good deed goes unpunished in that kind of climate.
Yeah. And maybe, I mean, you also told me stories of people you've known, things you've observed with regards to slavery in Nigeria.
For sure. It always fills me with some level of amusement in the West, the attitude towards things like slavery and indentured servitude. And again, I'm in no way, shape, or form defending these practices. And particularly within the black community, where the discussion has been very, very much around slavery is something that whites did to persons of color. And it's like, well, that isn't historically true. Slavery is, of course, a uniquely repugnant practice. It's
but been around for a long time.
Absolutely. And even to this day and age in Nigeria, you have people who are, for all intents and purposes, slaves owned by other blacks. Individuals who, through poverty.
So what is the I mean, maybe I think what would interest us all. What is the process? I mean, how does somebody end up a de facto slave in Nigeria?
For sure, you simply need to be born poor. That is the number one risk factor. You need to be born poor, and your parents may not have the confidence that they can look after you, that they can give you enough food, or they can provide you any form of education. And then they will quite happily often, just hand you over to another family, and that individual will work as a slave for the rest of their life.
Now, so that's interesting. And so in this arrangement, by slave you mean not a serving person, not a servant, but a person who will receive food and room and board, but the person who's, I guess, bought or taken that slave in, or serving, I don't even know what to call them, I guess slave, has absolute power, meaning yes. if the slave in the house doesn't obey the master, doesn't do something or displeases, he or she can be punished and possibly, I guess, killed outright.
Yes, absolutely. You will, let's say, for example, you're a female and the, master of the house happens to take a liking to you. Well, you're now his sexual partner. So there's really no limitation on what can happen to you. And again, I'm completely against the institution of slavery, and I just always found it amusing.
Now, you're just describing a reality that exists there.
For sure.
Now, and I think you also mentioned that this sort of slavery of basically living under the yoke of an absolute master, that's actually preferable to being quote unquote free and poor.
Yes, absolutely, and maybe that's why I guess I have a level of that I can't quite understand some of the kind of visceral emotion that comes when the issue of slavery is discussed, because there's this view that individuals end up in slavery. Usually, somebody comes into your village in the middle of the night and just carries everybody away. A lot of individuals voluntarily put themselves into these situations because it quite simply is better to be somebody's de facto slave than to simply starve to death somewhere. So without an individual who has a greater level of wealth and food security than yourself, you will starve in the absence of, some kind of a welfare state. Nobody will come to look after you. There is no
and there is no welfare in Nigeria.
There is no welfare. There is no government to turn to. You will find no education. You will find no clothing on your back. You will not find water to quench your thirst. It is often a preferable situation, and people will see it almost as a mark of esteem to be taken into a wealthy person's house in this way, because I guess the alternative is starvation. I think the idea that we have, particularly in the West, about institutions such as slavery, I don't think they're accurate. Number one, it isn't. Slavery is unique to the human experience. It's a human thing as opposed to whites on blacks. It's black. I've seen enough blacks literally enslave others, in my own country, and also the position of the slave. Let's be very, very clear here. And I certainly wouldn't want slavery on anybody. I wouldn't want to be a slave myself. But the alternatives are often starvation. People will, in the face of alternatives, often happily take these positions on. And again, I'm not placing a value judgment there. If I had a choice between starving to death, because remember that the consequence. So it's not like the West where, me being hungry may be some justification towards robbing a convenience store or stealing apples. Theft over in my country is punished with death. If you're caught, you will die. You'll be very, very lucky if the police save you, but in most situations, they will fuck you up. So, in the absence of alternatives, and maybe you can't find a job, and you have 2-3 children, often it's better to just say, look, let's go and plead with this individual down the road who seems to have some wealth. Let's plead with this person just to take on this child, and essentially have them do all of their housework or farm work. And hopefully for sure they'll feed the child, and maybe they will even throw in an education for the child. So people then do it to their own children.
Well, it seems, a better alternative to do that than to just essentially knowingly try to raise a child where you don't have the means or the money, and the child will probably die.
Exactly. So again. And my real concern always lies when we assign, let's say, value judgments to social situations without really trying to understand the unique circumstance which bring them into being. So why is it that, for example, that despite the best efforts of the United Nations to eradicate slavery, de facto slavery still exists? Because, people are poor, and people don't want to starve to death, and I absolutely don't blame them. I wouldn't want to starve to death. A choice between starvation and slavery, I would happily choose slavery.
All right, I think it's impossible to. I think that we're kind of. I talked about this in my chat with Dr. Lehman in Germany. If we were put back in those situations, how would we have acted? And everyone is self-righteous, think, I would have stood up to the Nazis. Who knows? We don't. When we're in a desperate situation, we don't know how we're going to act. I'm pretty sure I would allow myself to become enslaved or whatever. I guess this is the really difficult question, right? And you've never seemed to be a person, having talked so much to you by now, who would say, well, this is all because of the British colony, and it's all the problems in Nigeria because you're colonized, and you wouldn't say that.
No, because for me it isn't accurate. And again, colonialism had its own issues, but of course it's always, in my opinion, important to be rational when approaching a topic. And just to be factual, the problems we experience, if it was strictly down to colonialism, Ghana would have experienced the same issues. Ghana has not. Ghana has not had a civil war. They don't have the endemic corruption. They don't.
Number one country in Africa, apparently.
Absolutely. And they had, the British, as the kind of colonial force there. And independence was granted roughly around the same time, I think maybe half a decade apart. So if it was strictly an issue of colonialism, we would have seen the same structures or the same, sectarian violence or the same ethnic cleansing that we, experience, let's say, in Nigeria or Rwanda. There are deeper issues.
Well, that's an interesting question. I know I asked you this privately, but maybe for the audience. That's a country in Africa that I actually wouldn't mind visiting just because it seems to be the safest. But Ghana, why is Ghana so much more of a success story than its neighbors and places such as Nigeria and other places in West Africa, or Africa in general? Do you think?
That's a great question, and I guess I can only hypothesize, but I think it's multifaceted. The first thing is that, very, very thankfully for Ghana, that they didn't discover oil till, maybe about a decade ago. I think it's about 10 years ago now, or it's like, so they didn't discover oil soon after the kind of independence was granted. So the oil that we discovered in Nigeria led to essentially the setup of a level of corruption, institutionalized corruption, which was really quite incredible and unprecedented. So they had far more time to grow as a society and, develop a reliance on far less politically sensitive, foreign exports. So there's a very, very big difference between the, let's say, kind of politics you get into internationally when you're exporting, cocoa beans for chocolate and, yams, versus petroleum, and then you're a part of OPEC. So Nigeria as a society, not only did we develop, we found oil, and at the time it was thought to be a blessing, but I think most individuals will really look at it and say, actually, that was uniquely harmful to the country. In our current stage of development, finding oil was absolutely terrible. And then the second thing is that there are just very, very different cultural differences. So from what I understand, and my best friend, one of my very, very close friends is a Ghanaian. Within Ghana, you don't tend to have the kind of rigid tribalism that we experience in Nigeria. So in Nigeria, people will, for example, be really, really happy. So I'm Yoruba. A Yoruba, president is coming in. And people, the Yorubas will say, this is wonderful because he's going to give us more stuff, in the kind of big, of all the oil money, we're going to get more. And that's, in the mentality, that's very, very acceptable, that because our guy is now in there, we're going to benefit at the expense of everybody else. And again, everybody does this. And Ghana doesn't seem to suffer from that kind of tribalistic, mentality, which really means within Nigeria that there's far less cooperation. There's far more kind of mistrust and mismanagement. And also, for some reason in Nigeria, corruption isn't punished in the same way. And again, there are lots and lots of reasons for this. People will very, very gladly execute the guy who stole a banana or a grapefruit, sure, absolutely, stole 2 coconuts. And you'll find his body by the side of the road, burnt up the next day. If somebody steals $100 million, nobody's going to touch you. Because by that point, you would have bribed everybody worth bribing. And they're all implicated in the thing. Well, what are they going to do? You're going to arrest the state governor? It's not going to happen. So it pays to steal vast amounts of money.
But it seems to me that, even accounting for those possibilities, Ghana, it just, from what I've read, and I'm hardly an expert, it seems sort of a freak occurrence. When you look at the countries around, Benin, Togo, Nigeria, Liberia is one of the worst countries in the world, just hands down. As far as I know, Liberia makes Nigeria not quite a paradise, but look pretty cool, I think.
Yes, it's very, very, very violent. Even the border of Togo and going to Nigeria, people don't drive there at night.
In particular, Liberia during the Civil War there, Vice had a fantastic. Check it out; it's still there. This is when Vice actually did real interesting stuff. I don't know what happened to them. They turned into SJWs or who knows. But this was obviously post Civil War because people couldn't be there at the time. But there were images and film footage. You could see these people when you're talking bad, savage. They weren't just killing people. They were killing people and literally, with their bare hands, ripping their organs, their hearts out of their chest, and eating it raw.
Yes, it's the idea that if they eat the man's organs, then they'll be protected from bullets. Yeah, absolutely. So it takes on a very barbaric.
Yeah, and the guy that they interviewed there, who has since become a priest, who murdered probably hundreds of people, it was referred to as General Butt Naked, and this was because his militia at the time believed, supposedly, that if they ran around naked, this nakedness, this nudity, would protect them from bullet hail as well. Apparently, it did in his case. But
for sure, I think whenever former warlords or child soldiers become priests, because it's kind of the done thing. What other occupation? It's I guess the priesthood's an occupation that as long as you can read and write, then you're pretty much fine. And
and you can tell everyone the story of being a reformer, and you've changed. And
it often is the only avenue back into society. It often is.
Yeah, but it doesn't seem like any of these. I mean, another one, Cote d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast. Yeah. None of these African countries, with the exception of Ghana, seem to. I mean, they're not places that, frankly speaking, if you're just a Western white guy, you just want to be wandering around.
For sure. It depends. As a white guy, you're probably safer in certain areas, and in certain areas far less safe. So it's kind of the extremes of one of the. You certainly don't want to be, let's say, a white guy walking around in the petroleum region. Yeah.
Well, I was gonna mention that, and maybe we can talk about it. I mean, if you're working in, I guess they're essentially swampland, in the oil swamps, that's an exceptionally dangerous profession.
Oh yes.
Not just because
Absolutely.
of the actual labor itself, but because people kidnap you and try to ransom you for excessive amounts of money. Isn't that right?
Absolutely, and not only that, but of course, because the area is so oil rich that individuals go and basically try to divert the oil, the actual pipes, and then set up their own kind of backyard refineries, and the risks of, the rates of explosions, it's absolutely terrifying.
So you have to deal with workplace danger from
absolutely.
Malfunctions, the explosions.
Absolutely, and the ever-present risk of kidnap. And again, I guess what I would say is this. I mean, the individuals in that particular region, in my opinion, that they actually have very, very legitimate concerns in that the government of Nigeria is
in bed with the oil companies.
It's not only that. When you look at the area and the ecological devastation that the refining, the refining of the petrol, the petrochemicals, the ecological damage that it has wrought on the area is absolutely immense. So they were farmers and they can no longer farm their land. The land is for all intents and purposes barren. The water supplies have poisoned, and they do have very, very legitimate concerns. Of course, I'm not in any way suggesting that kidnap and murder ought to be the responses for that. However, the government and successive governments have marginalized them whenever they have complained. They have simply ignored them, and in many ways, they were only listened to when they started murdering and kidnapping. So, if they had simply listened to them 30 years earlier when they said, hold on, look, the children are being born deformed, and, we were farming, we don't want a handout from the government, we were farming successfully here for, thousands of years, and now the farmland, is gone, the water has been completely used up in the, petrochemical.
So in the case of the oil-related violence, it's not sectarian; it's just sort of pragmatic-based.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay. And then also, successive governments have then come in to say, okay, look, we're going to rehouse you, and they say, well, we really don't want to be rehoused. I mean, we don't, you can't rehouse. Let's say, for example, a group of individuals wanted to take my people and rehouse us in another part of the country. We'll be eaten alive. We haven't anything in common with these people. We don't share the same foods, and they will see us as an enemy in their midst. So the idea of it's not. I guess it's very different from the European experience, where at least now that it's far more kind of homogeneous. This isn't. So they've said, we'll rehouse you. Well, no, they don't want to be rehoused. And again, they have a very, very legitimate reason for not wanting to be rehoused. They have said to them, we will provide you subsidies instead of your farmland. Well, the subsidies haven't come through. And even when it's come through, the inflation.
Just a lot of bullshit, basically.
Absolutely. So in many ways, they literally have been pushed to just picking up AK-47s. And you put a 15-year-old kid with an AK-47. Rationality, should he kidnap this oil worker or not? Hey.
So I imagine their positions that are some of these oil workers Western people who are willing to take the risk and?
Yes, absolutely. So the danger money, there's a little bit more money involved, but it's extraordinary.
I would imagine the salary would have to be phenomenal because the level of risk involved, and it's dirty, dangerous work in itself. And then you have to worry constantly that, someone's going to ride by with an AK-47 and kidnap you.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And, thankfully, the kidnappings, when the ransoms have been paid, they've usually given the person back. Right. Thankfully, it's not quite...
they're honest criminals.
Yes, it's not quite gotten to the level where... Which you sometimes see in other, maybe other, even far more dangerous parts of the world, where they'll just, they'll have killed the person and they'll ask for the ransom. So they'll give the person back.
There are worse. I don't want to go on the tangent. There's certain places of Central America, like Honduras. I think Honduras at the moment has the highest murder rate in the world, I believe.
For sure.
Those are not places you really want to be hanging out as anyone.
For sure.
Now, you spoke of the different regions. Maybe talk about Boko Haram. Now, I've done some reading on this, and Boko Haram has been around since the early 2000s.
Oh, yeah.
And it's interesting that it seems we only really heard about it in the mainstream, including myself. I found out after the fact until the sort of international outcry at, I think it was 276, 300 schoolgirls were kidnapped.
Absolutely.
And then the entire world took notice, but they've been around for basically well over a decade.
Oh, absolutely. And again, Boko Haram, I guess in Nigeria, is well known for picking soft targets of boys. They'll simply go to a school because it's a kind of Islamic thing with the anti-education kind of thing thrown in as well, and they will simply shoot everybody. And
I'm sorry to interrupt, CS, but you I'm assuming you knew about Boko Haram before they made international headlines.
Oh yes, absolutely.
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 Yeah.
In fact, I the one group, kind of group, they'll leave, kind of mosque school alone. But it's in the north of our country. So any schools there that they will target them, and they don't leave the boys alive. And which is what I found it incredible that they focus strictly on the girls when these guys have murdered and kidnapped boys for the best part of 12, 13 years. It's incredible.
I imagine when they kidnap them, part of it's sort of an indoctrination attempt. They need more foot soldiers, or I guess holy warriors or whatever, to fight for their cause. I did actually see it wasn't too bad. There was a Vice documentary, I don't know, but certainly a piece on Boko Haram. And I think there's a multinational, Nigeria as well as some of the surrounding countries, sort of alliance to combat them. But they seem largely ineradicable. That's my impression.
Yes, it's the same issue that when a larger force fights, for all intents and purposes, Boko Haram are a guerrilla-based group. And if you kind of look at the position they're based in the country, it's in Borno states. So you're talking the real kind of north, the northern tip of Nigeria. So places like Maiduguri. So these are Hausa parts of the country, and when you realize that what you have in that part of the country, and I've been to that part of the country before. You go past Kano, and it's a ridiculously long drive, but you essentially have vast open deserts. And these guys are uniquely, they were born there. That is their terrain. They know how to survive in the desert. They're extremely competent at it. It's their home. When you get to somewhere like Maiduguri, you don't. Also, Nigeria is very, very central. Like everything, we try to congregate. You have Abuja right in the center, so you don't tend to have a lot of law in that part of the country anyway. So if insurgency did spring up anywhere, it would certainly be in that part of the country, which it did. So I'm unsurprised that they're very, very difficult to eradicate because the Nigerian army isn't geared up to basically taking on a force of individuals who will hit a school today and within 4 hours have literally taken, fast jeeps and simply gone into the desert. Like, the Nigerian army it isn't geared up to that. It may develop those skills a little bit later on. So I'm very, very unsurprised that they haven't eradicated them, or, and if they ever will be able to, and it's causing a huge displacement, of persons from that part of the country.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk about that. I forgot what the percentages were off the top of my head, but it was, I think, maybe 30% of these so-called economic migrants are coming from Nigeria. Sure. I saw an interview on Danish television of a Nigerian who left his family behind because he just thought he would arrive in Denmark and drive a nice car and have a nice house, and he's going back because he could actually have a better life in Nigeria apparently. He just thought he would just get the stuff. He'd arrive and boom. I mean, you're someone who's very in touch with reality, and everyone listening has been listening so far. I mean, I think most of us can agree that in the context of Europe, that's not the kind of society any of us really wants to live in.
Absolutely.
I can I can't say I completely relate, but growing up in the 80s in New York City, when it was still very violent, particularly in the Bronx and areas from the Bronx to Manhattan, where you still had the graffiti all over the trains, and there was always a kind of tenseness in the air. You always felt like you had, and I had been mugged and robbed and assaulted more than once, and so you grow up with a bit of sort of a cautious feeling. I've noticed in myself that's eroded over the years as I've lived in incredibly safe places by way of comparison, and even now you can't compare New York City in 2016, and I haven't been there since 2009, but with the 80s, and so I can kind of sense that, but I can't. I mean, that level of corruption and venality, and it's absolutely incredible. So and I think you pointed out as well is that when people have this mentality, they're not going to just get rid of it when they arrive in Europe. I mean,
absolutely.
I think this is what happened in Cologne. I mean, I do think. Let me say for the record, I think Sargon's coverage of the Cologne thing has been terrible and inaccurate, but. The event was not pleasant, but exaggerated.
Yeah, for sure.
Extremely. I mean, there was not a crowd there where people opened. 200 people weren't gunned down.
Exactly.
Some people were robbed. There might have been one or two actual rapes, but most people, in these women, they were fondled.
They were just basically fondled. Somebody grabbed her breasts or her ass.
Yeah, maybe they lost 10 or 20 euros. Okay, but but the fact of the matter is, when I said that this is fairly normal activity for people coming from extremely impoverished countries with limited opportunities, they're not thinking when they arrive, oh, well, we're going to adopt and adapt to this. They're going on autopilot.
Exactly, absolutely. And again, I think you've raised a hugely important, kind of topic there, that the behavioral norms that we're used to in the West, the idea that people will leave you alone and you don't have to be worried about, theft and violence. This is unique. It's excellent and it's unique. And my hope is, of course, that my own country develops along these lines and we have reduced murder rates.
That's your hope,
absolutely.
But based on conversations I've had with you don't think that's realistic.
I don't believe so because of the direction and because a lot of the factors that are needed to make a society safer. As a country, we're simply not moving in that direction, in my opinion. We're doing some things well, some things terribly. So that there are lots and lots of issues there, and I think just in terms of the point you raised, that the standard of living of the poorest persons in a society really determines, in my opinion at least, the behavioral norms that we all experience. So if the poorest are so poor that they can expect starvation, you can expect far more crime. If the poorest of our society, so for example, even as a homeless man in the UK, potentially there is a potential that I can, maybe sign on for government benefits and
homeless shelter.
Absolutely. Now, this helps rein in some of the worst excesses of the human ape. the desire to basically go and steal something from another person is greatly diminished when most of my needs are catered for with my employment. When I can count on where my next meals are coming from. This tends to rein in a huge part of the destructiveness of our species, and a lot of the kind of violence and the structural, particularly the structural violence, the attitude of police towards citizens, the likelihood of police to murder. It really, in my opinion, stems from, again, that fact that when the standard of living is low enough, humans simply adapt to their environment with greater levels of violence and force and coercion and, unconcern towards human welfare and life. And in many ways, in my opinion anyway, our goal in Europe, and I speak as, I'm a Nigerian, so I speak as a Nigerian, but the goal in Europe, and I'm a temporary resident over here.
Well, you keep on. I consider you European, but all right, fair enough.
But the goal in Europe should be to maintain the standard of living when, let's say, for example, 2 million odd refugees are permitted into maybe Germany or the UK over a couple of years. It reduces everybody's standard of living, and it actually makes the society safe, far less safe. Societies don't become poorer and still keep up all of the social niceties that we have towards one another. If your next door neighbor doesn't know where the next meal is coming from, and it may actually get there, if the welfare system is pushed, hard enough, if enough money is printed, everybody is simply less safe. We're very, very safe because people have a roof over their head in the majority. People have money in their pockets in the majority. The moment these things are eroded, whether slowly or whether quickly over time, it certainly makes the society just a far less appealing place to live.
And you have even spoken, not negatively, but perhaps accurately, about some of the negative consequences of within the Nigerian community in the UK. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. I mean, my concerns with the Nigerian community, and I voice this regularly to other Nigerians, is the real lack of desire to integrate, into the British society. I think, well, look, guys, if you love Nigeria so much, just buy a ticket and just go back home. I enjoy Nigeria too. I love the sunshine. I love the food, but I value the forms of behavior in the West, the respect for the rule of law, the fact that I am less likely to be a victim of crime. But what I've noticed in the Nigerian community, particularly in the UK, is a real desire to simply stay Nigerian at all costs. And what I mean by that is, violence towards children, just beating up their kids. I just find this absolutely repugnant. The attitudes towards integration, the idea that the local British culture is somehow inferior to that of the Nigerian, culture. So all of these, things are pervasive, and I've had multiple talks with Nigerians who will say, well, England is great, but what they really need is a police state. Because, quite honestly, for them, a police state works. In Nigeria, the police state meant if somebody robbed them, either the police would just simply catch the person and shoot the person if the police were that corrupt in the part of the country, or they could just shoot the person. And if an individual did something that the vast majority of people didn't like, the consequences were so insanely severe, violent canings, that kind of thing. So, and a lot of them have expressed a real fondness for really just the worst forms of totalitarianism. The idea that, freedom of speech should be absolutely limited to not criticizing the government, not, criticizing religious beliefs. This is pervasive within the Nigerian community. And I'm not just speaking, of course, of Muslims. There are diehard Christians who will, just go wild if somebody criticizes a passage of the Bible. Or, and what I guess I always find concerning is, look, you don't have to be in this part of the world, but if you do, you have to respect the rule of law. If it's the law over here that one shouldn't violently aggress against children, please do respect that. There's a reason that law is in place. But you don't have to be here. You can simply go back to our joint home in Nigeria, and then if you choose to, which I hope you don't, you can beat your children to death.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of touching on an area I wanted to talk about anyway, but I mean, maybe because it seems related to the white flight in London. I mean, as of now, I believe European people are essentially a minority in London. That's true, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Particularly English people. They're a real they're a real minority now in the capital. And again, I find it very, very disappointing because, look, again, I'm a Nigerian, and it's certainly no intention of mine to displace the natives from, these are their homes. And I'm particularly concerned about immigration, as I'm a Nigerian with a British passport.
But I mean, you're also English. Come on, I mean, I know you're Nigerian, but all the values. I mean, we have a lot in common in terms of the things that we value, and freedom of speech and freedom of free inquiry. I mean, those are not Nigerian values. So whatever your ethnic origin might be, I mean, certainly intellectually, and I hate to use the word spiritually, but the spirit. I mean, take no offense. It's meant as a compliment, but I consider you European. I mean, my understanding, I said it in the previous video, I'm not I don't believe in this sort of, European ethnic purity. What I think is important is that people who want to live in Europe or the UK or wherever in Europe adhere to the rule of law, but also believe in the principles.
Absolutely.
So, and that, I don't care if you're from, Indonesia, Nigeria, Canada, Norway, it doesn't really matter. I think that's the important thing.
Agreed.
I mean, to be fair, I think you're a better exemplar of some of these principles than your average, white English person in some regards. So.
Okay. But my real concern with the whole immigration issue is that not only is it financially untenable, it's completely untenable. When one looks at the mentality of a lot of individuals coming into the country, and again, I speak within the Nigerian community, I've had individuals who literally have maybe arrived for a week, and I meet them because it's a community you tend to know a lot of people, and people know people. So, and people just come up to me and say, look, how do I claim benefits? I simply don't know. I've never claimed the thing, but why don't you get a job? No, I want to claim benefits. And of course, within a month or two, the guy's got some girl pregnant. They're living in some house somewhere given by the government, and he's claiming benefits. And 15 years on, he's still on that situation, probably even working and claiming the benefits as well. So I don't think this society over here is quite ready for that many people to come in with that mentality. Sure, there are absolutely individuals who come over here who want to work and who want to make a positive contribution, but there are also lots and lots of other individuals who literally expect the system over here to look after them from cradle to grave and to pay for any reproductive choices they make. So maybe they meet some girl, they knock her up. They expect the government to then turn around and hand them a house. And so far for them, it's working. And that for me is a huge part of why I'm very, very concerned about the wave of immigration, because the country simply cannot afford it. I'm a taxpayer over here. And, I would rather my taxes used to pay for a hospital because, hey, there's maybe I get hit by a car or something and I want medical care. I'm a taxpayer, and surely that should that should then go towards me, as opposed to using the taxes to essentially fund people who aren't putting anything back into the system.
Would you say that your observations of the Nigerian community in the UK also apply to varying degrees to, say, the West Indian community and the Pakistani community? And I mean, is this it's almost universal phenomenon?
Absolutely, from what I've seen so far. From what I've seen so far, and again, I'm certainly not painting these individuals with a kind of blanket, or with a broad brush. But I've come in contact with lots and lots of individuals in these communities who have not done a day of work for 30, 40 years, since they got here. They've always been on benefits, and that's, and again, I'm not, if an individual is obviously, has some kind of a disability, these are males and females who are more than able to work, who simply don't want to. That I know so many people like this. They just have no desire to work.
Do you think that this situation with immigrants who are essentially exploiting the system, as opposed to immigrants who are well integrated and essentially adopted the country's values, has led to the creation of things, say, like the English Defence League?
Yes, absolutely.
Trying to the not UKIP, sorry, the BNP.
The BNP, absolutely.
I mean, it seems that whenever you get a situation like that, you create a sense of resentment.
Absolutely.
And then people actually start displaying perhaps legitimate racism when there wasn't any prior.
Exactly. I completely agree with you there. Because in the absence of a legal, way for these individuals to have their grievances heard and put into the legislative process, they often have no resort but to turn to groups, which for all intents and purposes boil down to armed thuggery. If they have said for years, look, we're taxpayers over here, and these individuals are coming, and we've been on the waiting list to get a house from the government for 6 months. This individual is able to come in a day and get a place. Of course, that leads to real resentment. So while I'm certainly skeptical about a lot of their rhetoric, I can understand they have very, very legitimate grievances. They're not just, racists as the media would, kind of portray them to be. And again, look, if, for example, I'm in Nigeria, I'm a taxpayer over there, and we had some kind of a government service, and other individuals who hadn't paid taxes were able to show up and simply benefit from those services, I would feel very, very hard done by. And and that doesn't mean I hate those individuals, but really, if we don't give individuals a voice and allow such a voice to filter into actual policy, all we can expect is violence. The end result of these things.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something that Sam Harris has observed many times. That the only options human beings have are conversation or violence.
Absolutely.
There's nothing else.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's no real in between. Negotiations, politics, that's conversation. Beating people up, shooting people, that's violence. That's it.
And possibly because things have become so comfortable in the West, we don't realize just how thin the line is between these things, how quickly one can descend into the other. If people are poor enough, if they're aggravated enough, they will blow things up. If you push people far enough. I think
we've become sort of like fattened lambs in a way. And I think that's why I think this talk with you is so important, because it casts light, shows that on the way, I would argue, probably a majority of the world lives. This experiment going on in Europe is reasonably unique and of course imperfect, and there are a lot of problems, but what multiculturalism has done, and by that I don't necessarily mean accepting people just who aren't ethnic Europeans, but people who are not willing to essentially acknowledge the superiority of European values, because that's, I think, for me, the most important thing. I have no qualms in saying, and I think you would agree, that European values in their totality are better than Nigerian values.
I would certainly agree. And again, by those, absolutely. So the rule of law taking precedence, the separation of the church and state, absolutely essential. Non-aggression principle. The idea that violence...
Lack of slavery.
Absolutely. The idea that violence must be centralized into the hands of the government so that my neighbor isn't able to just arrest me and put me in a private jail. Due process. These things are absolutely essential. And if I wanted to live in a state of, anarchy and violence, I would simply go back home. Quite honestly.
Yeah. I mean, this scene. I mean, you should really listen to him. I mean, I know you consider yourself Nigerian, but I mean, you're English as well, and this is what these people, especially these social justice warriors. I'm sure you heard about what happened in Oxford over this statue, Cecil Rhodes.
Oh yeah.
Who was a white guy who apparently set up some of the parameters that led to apartheid. there. Okay. And I don't know if it's been removed. I haven't followed up, but they were certainly insisting, mostly students, non-white students, and some other people, insisting that it be removed because, he contributed to the apartheid state. And I will be talking to people from South Africa, so don't worry.
He also massively contributed to the development of the area. They forget the hospitals built. And again, I'm not saying he's a good guy or a bad guy, but it's always important to try to look at a situation or look at an individual's actions as a whole. So let's say, for example, my whole life or for half of my life, I was actually a positive member of society, but then I once or even punched some guy, and that's my real concern with these SJWs. It's revisionist history, and it's,
well, they only focus on the bad things.
Yes, absolutely.
And they take for granted, and that's what disgusts me the most. They take for granted all these things they're allowed to do. They take for granted, for example, the science that brought about their stupid iPhones and their stupid Twitter, and they take for granted the architecture and engineering that created the buildings that they live in, the plumbing system.
Exactly.
And they take for granted the fact that they're blathering on, talking, and there are legal documents which enshrine their rights to blather on and talk. And it's absolutely disgusting. I'm not talking about some sort of insane pride in this, but a little respect for the people that have gone before you and created this. And I'm not, once again, I'm not talking about being ethnically European here. These are principles that on balance work better than they do in other parts of the world. I mean, I can even I don't want to go too much on a tangent. At the time, I've talked a lot about South Korea, but it's not a bad society. It's even safer than the West in some ways. But that's because everyone's a freaking Confucianist conformist. Nobody has any individual personality. The people there are pretty unhappy on average because they're so afraid of bringing shame to themselves and everyone. And so I would argue that it's imperfect, but the Western system is pretty much the best we've come up with so far.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
These people, I feel sometimes with these social justice warriors and these people ranting on about colonialism and, white guilt and all this, that, why don't we send them down to Lagos to hang out at night or Angola or, just or someplace really nasty in South Africa, and they can have fun. They can talk about how great the cultures are there, and I'm sure they'd have a good time.
For sure, and I guess my real concern with a lot of these SJWs is that they romanticize peasant life.
Oh,
it's they because of course they've never often directly experienced these parts of the world. That they believe that it's the kind of, I guess, the meme of the kind of happy-go-lucky peasant life isn't like that. It's uniquely dangerous. The state sees you as a potential threat. The local police officer, or you can be, because they you have no legal recourse. You can be murdered at will, and that's if you don't starve to death, or you pick up maybe some kind of a mild case of malaria and you're dead in a couple of weeks. So a lot of the I guess rhetoric comes from really being in what is the safest part of the world and the safest time in history.
It's the only thing that lets them even get away with
absolutely.
it. Absolutely. And we're of course there's some resistance, but we're certainly ceding quite a bit of our rights to them. I mean, I don't know where the scales are right now, but I think it's enough is enough. I mean, everyone's done. I said this before, and I'm going to repeat it until this ends. But everyone's done bad stuff. But on balance, the West has done a lot of good, and people are benefiting. People who don't, whether they're Western or not, ethnically, and just to disregard all of that is insane. I mean, a little bit of respect would be nice. Now, getting back to Africa, so one or two more questions. You don't sound hopeful towards Nigeria. I have sort of, I guess, an amateur interest in Africa. I've visited at least Eastern Africa. I've been to Northern Africa, and reading some of the literature, it seems like Africa is just a hopeless case. And I can tell you why. I mean, I was listening to this German sociologist talk about the level of export in Africa and how it's something like 40% less than just the Netherlands, and that only occurs with the help of the Chinese and Western powers. Even.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, we've been subsidized. The West has been subsidizing Africa. I mean, is there a solution for Africa, or is it just fuck it, we can't do anything about it?
Well, it depends. In my opinion, there are solutions, but I don't believe the world is ready to accept them as solutions, because the way the world tends to see Africa is almost like the way we see poverty in, let's say, the UK. So, for example, poverty in the UK is something that is seen as the government's issue to tackle. So, let's tax everybody, let's build houses for these poor people. Okay, let's ignore the fact that we then, as a result of all of these direct social welfare interventions, create intergenerational dependency on the government and intergenerational, joblessness and illiteracy. And these are some of the big issues there. So half of the issues that I see in Africa simply won't go away because of the foreign aid, that instead of individuals, learning the hard way and suffering if need be, learning the hard way to build up one's own society, to learning the direct and painful consequences of not having the rule of law in place, and as a result, building a society, that comes as a result of those past learnings, learning the consequences of not separating church and state, and as a result, dealing with those consequences. So until we are no longer shielded as a continent from the consequences of poor policy, I don't see much progress. And we mustn't forget, growth started to really, really flourish in Europe when Europe abandoned the idea of, the kind of marriage between church and state, when areas of science began to critically look at the influence of, the Catholic Church and the Protestant, kind of movements, when they started to say, well, hold on, look, the earth isn't flat, no matter what you say in the Bible, that it wasn't created 6,000 years ago, and the sun doesn't, the earth is not the, kind of center of the solar system. And when they started to challenge these kind of basic dogmas and tenets, of religiosity. So, and we, as a continent, we haven't yet faced the consequences of very, very bad policy, because there's always been a bailout. Things get too bad, the IMF come in, or this other group, one or another of these alphabet agencies come in with money, so it props up artificially very, very bad policy. So let's say, for example, the government decides, okay, the best thing we can do with the increased government budget this year is that we're going to buy all members of parliament, brand new Cadillacs, as they routinely do in Nigeria. So, every, year or two, maybe they'll spend $40 million on new cars, and all their security detail need to have new this and that. Well, half of this money is just coming from loans and, structural programs from this bank or the World Bank or this. And it's important that if such a government embarks on such a stupid use of resources, that they face the direct consequences of it, and the country face the consequences of it. So as a result, in the future, we demand more from the elected leadership. So maybe it's unconstitutional then at one point for the president to be able to simply buy everybody, Jeeps, or it's unconstitutional to use government funds in a certain way and then have structures in place to punish that. So half of the issues I see, which is why I really do, believe they're insurmountable, that there are structures in place to make sure these countries keep on getting money, irrespective of how well they do or how well they manage their own economies.
Now, I mean, we talked about this before, and this is super taboo, but you suggested that one way that to get things rolling would be to have foreigners, I guess Europeans, come in and start directing the government, possibly.
Absolutely. And again, just before people kind of throw all sorts of accusations at me, I'm a huge believer in the best person for the job. I really, for me, it's all about meritocracy. So if the best person to run a country. So, for example, let's say, I live in the UK. If the best person to run the Bank of England is a Canadian guy, sure. I don't care about the color of the person's passport. I want, personally, the best individual who is most qualified and most competent for that job in the position. If that individual cannot be found locally, I'm more than happy and totally support the idea of finding an individual who's a foreigner. I really don't care if a guy from the Philippines or South Korea or Mexico or the US or England or Ghana is the president of Nigeria, as long as that individual is the best person to run the country, whether that person's Nigerian or what. So I'm far less, I guess, jingoistic and nationalistic. For me, it's really who is the most competent person to do the job, who really understand what needs to get done, and who has the will to push through the very, very difficult things that we need to make the long-term changes necessary to have a vibrant economy where, life expectancy goes up and, there's enough food for everyone and, people are employed and they don't have to resort to violence to essentially have their sustenance.
This is all in hindsight, obviously, but do you think if British involvement hadn't been cut off so abruptly and there had been, I guess, a sort of a transitional period or some level of governance, that maybe things would be better now?
That is a very, very large possibility. For example, if we had a situation like, let's say, Hong Kong, I would much rather Nigeria be in the position of Hong Kong than Nigeria is today. So yes, I would say that is certainly accurate.
Yeah. Well, folks, I think you really gotten a sense for what the third world is like and why it's just so undesirable, and why mass immigration of people who obviously going through horrible circumstances, poverty, circumstances beyond their control. If we only work with our emotions and just say, oh, we'll just accept everybody, everything that makes Europe good is going to eventually disappear, because economically, it's my biggest concern. It's not sustainable. Culturally, listen to what CS is talking about. The Nigerian community saying, well, the government should have the power just to kill you, basically. Yeah. Whenever it wants to. These are not. I don't want to live in that, and I imagine many of you don't either. And it's, what we need to have is rational voices. I think throughout Europe and all the countries, because there's so many debates are not being had because of this mass immigration. Yeah. The economic crisis, the eurozone. Well, as you pointed out, we're about to head into a depression, basically, right?
Yes, for all. The ECB. Were planning to bail things out again. I saw that on Friday, but the stock market lost. I think just 50 billion was wiped off the UK, FTSE 100 just on Wednesday alone. So absolutely, I certainly. Based on the stock market that we've seen so far, we are certainly entering a depression if we're not in one already.
Yeah. So we can't. We as in the politicians and anyone involved can't really address these things as long as we have to deal with mass immigration. It's a huge issue, and I think ultimately, there will be a referendum in the UK sometime in 2017 for the UK to leave. I think the UK should, if only to be able to control its own borders, and I think a lot of other countries might follow suit, which is a shame.
For sure.
Even the Schengen Agreement now is just not working out well because of the immigrations. So products that normally would just go over the borders seamlessly are now, there are complications because everything needs to be controlled and checked.
Absolutely.
This whole thing has been idiotic, and I would argue this push for multiculturalism, this idea that diversity, I'm with you. I'm for the most competent, whatever that person might be. Diversity in itself is a good thing. So, let's get people who are yellow, red, purple, and green because, I don't know, that's a good thing by itself. It's really destructive. Unfortunately, the current situation, and it continues to be the same situation, is you either have the far left lunatics or the fascist left populists. nationalistic, ethnocentric populace, and very few voices in the middle. I mean, I guess you could maybe argue that some say in the UK, a Nigel Farage or UKIP is somewhere in the middle.
I like Farage. I like Farage. I don't think he's going to be elected anytime soon. They've really demonized him. They've, called him a racist, which is absurd. The man isn't a racist. At least I've seen nothing to suggest he is.
I haven't seen anything to suggest that he's a racist either. But these are the tactics that these people use. Yeah. When you talk about, limited, controlled immigration, Australia has an extremely harsh policy on immigration to push back the so-called boat people, or people who kind of, boat themselves in from places like Indonesia, Afghanistan, and certainly during the Vietnam War from Vietnam. And they've made a national announcement. Look, if you don't try to get a visa the conventional way, it doesn't matter if you have a family, if you're your only children, if you have children, if you're with children, if it's your grandmother, you're not going to get in.
Exactly.
And they've received some criticism for that, but to be honest, they're in a better position because of that. I mean, geographically they are anyway. But this long term, this is a really bad thing. And I think the important thing here as well is, I mean, CS is someone who comes from a violent, corrupt country and really appreciates the benefits and the qualities of a country that isn't originally his own. And it's funny that the natives, many of the natives have less respect, less reverence, and I would argue are less European and less English than he is. And that really says a lot. One thing, it tells you that he has a tremendous character, but it also tells you how far the West has sunk. But I think all we can do is continue to combat it, via something like this, like a podcast. But I think I'm gonna, in addition to just on my part, Evo Psych videos, and there'll be those as well. And I have to talk about this issue because I do think it's important, and I value these things. And whether I have an influence or not, I don't really know, but it's important and get all of these perspectives. That's why it's called Perspectives. But I think we've gotten some really great insight into what we want society not to be. I do want to try Nigerian food at some point, but,
for sure.
Because it sounds good.
It's very, very good. When you're next in the UK?
I shall, and but I don't know about trying out some of the other things going on there, burning people alive and wrapping tires. That doesn't seem all that great. Grilled tire human might be a dish to try later.
For sure.
Is there anything else you'd like to add before we finish up?
No, I'm just very, very grateful for the opportunity to have this discussion with you, and and I hope people do take note that turning Europe into a third world country is a possibility. We don't become a third world country by magic. It's when there's not enough money. It's really a financial thing, and if you have enough people coming over and overtaxes the system, a lot of them will be unproductive in the way we measure productivity.
Or criminal.
Absolutely, and the system over here is not designed to cope with that many people who are unemployed, determined to remain unemployed, who don't speak English, and determined to remain in that particular way. And I don't see how this is going to work. This certainly can't lead to a positive result.
Well, there you have it, folks. I wish people like Cameron and Merkel would listen to CS, but I don't think they will. You could never say anything like that, by the way, in Germany.
Oh, really?
Probably. Well, as a final note, Germany, I think my audience, and you know this by now, is just very limited in what you can express, even more so than the UK. So those sentiments are pretty rare, and when you do express them, you're called a fascist and whatever. So anyway, so everyone, thanks for listening. I hope that was informative. Like I said, this is from the horse's mouth. Someone who is from a third world country. This is, I think, none of us want this Europe to turn into this. So I think, get the word out. Yeah, and please, like and share the video. Not because I'm looking for fame, but I mean, really, I think people need to hear this voice. I mean, like I said, a well-educated, moral person from a third world who appreciates Western values. I don't think that you're always going to hear that. And so this was a great opportunity. So thanks for being here.
Thank you very, very much.